Hello and welcome to our second session on our study of the Exodus. In our last lesson, lesson 1, we looked at evidence for Joseph being in Egypt and also evidence for Jacob and his entire family going into Egypt. In this lesson, in part 1, we're going to be talking about the death of Jacob and the death of Joseph. We're going to be talking about Israelite multiplication, their descent into slavery, and then the birth of Moses. That's in this very first part 1. Joseph pledges to bury Jacob in Canaan. Jacob was in the land of Egypt for 17 years. He entered there 130 years old in 1656 BC. And 17 years later, at the age of 147, he dies. And he's going to be buried in Canaan. In Genesis 47, 29 through 30, this is what Jacob said to his son Joseph: "Bury me in Canaan with the other patriarchs." And that's where he was buried in 1639 BC. In Genesis 49:31, this is what, again, Jacob said to his son. He said, there at the cave of Machpelah, at Hebron, in Canaan's land, he said, there Abraham and Sarah are buried, Isaac and Rebekah, and there I buried Leah. That's at the cave of Machpelah. In Genesis 49:10, before Jacob dies, he blesses his sons. And he says to Judah, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his hand. He's talking about the coming of Christ. And so it would be through the line of Judah that Jesus Christ would be born. And then he dies. He's embalmed. It takes 40 days for him to be embalmed by the Egyptians. And then all of the dignitaries in Egypt, along with Joseph and his family, carry their father for over 500 miles back to this area in Canaan, the cave of the patriarchs. That's taken off of Google Earth. And on Google Earth, this is what you see: the cave of the patriarchs, because that's where Abraham had purchased a cave from Ephron the Hittite in order to have a burial plot for his people. Again, that is an area that everybody knows to be the place where the patriarchs were buried. The tombs of Isaac, the tombs of Abraham and Jacob in the area of Hebron. This is a marvelous building. It was built, actually, the walls on the outside part were built by Herod the Great, the same Herod who built the Second Temple in Jerusalem. So you're looking at some walls here that are over 2,000 years old. Again, built by Herod, the great architect, from limestone that was dug out of the ground around Jerusalem. The same type of limestone that you find in the Western Wall in the city of Jerusalem to this very day. And so this is a marvelous building. Some of those stones are 6 foot thick. Some of them are 24 feet long. It's an amazing building. There's another shot of the limestone building that's built around the cave of the patriarchs. Later, they added a hall of Isaac inside and a synagogue. And you have to stop and think about this building being a testimony of faith. You have to ask the question, why didn't Abraham carry his wife Sarah back to Mesopotamia, where they were from? That's the homeland. Why bury them in Canaan's land? At that time, when Sarah died, that land didn't belong to them. It belonged to the Canaanites. Why would he bury Sarah there? When my mother died in Florida, she made me and my brother promise to carry her back to Texas. Don't you dare bury me in Florida. You take me back to the homeland. And that's exactly what we did. You remember the movie Lonesome Dove? And you remember Gus said, you make sure you don't bury me up here. You take me back to Lonesome Dove. You take me back to Texas and you bury me there. Well, why did Abraham not take Sarah back to her homeland? Because he's taking a claim. He's taking a claim by faith that this land will one day belong to my offspring, to my children. And that's exactly what happened. There is a stairway that goes from the Hall of Isaac, you can see, down into a corridor. And at the end of the corridor, you find two caves. That's underground. The caves of the patriarchs. And then Joseph dies, Genesis 50, 22 through 25. He lived to be 110 years old and was buried in 1585 BC. And of course, he was first of all buried in Egypt. Joseph said, God will take you out of this land, talking to his brethren, to the land he promised on an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You must carry my bones up from this place, Joseph said. In our first lesson, we noticed in the excavation done by the Austrian Egyptologist that they uncovered these 12 tombs of Jacob's brothers and the tomb of Joseph. And they found the tomb of Joseph to be empty of the bones. Somebody had emptied the chamber. We talked about that in lesson 1. It's empty because they did carry his bones, as he told them, out of Egypt. And they entered the land many years later, and Joseph was buried in northern Israel at a place called Shechem, which today is Nablus, a city of over 100,000 people. And here is a photo from the 1800s of Joseph's tomb in Shechem near Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, the tomb of Joseph when they moved his bones there. In Exodus 1:6, Joseph and all of his brothers died. All that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. And when that occurred and a Pharaoh grew up that didn't know Joseph, they became fearful of being conquered by the Israelites and outsiders. So over a period of 3 or 4 generations, when they multiplied, Avaris becomes this large city. We talked about that in lesson 1. And then they spread throughout the land. And that's why the Egyptians became fearful. There's another photo of the city. There are other areas that have been excavated. And it's learned through those excavations in Egypt that the Israelite population was not simply concentrated just to Avaris, but in other areas of Egypt. Very numerous people all over the land. And when a new Pharaoh is on the throne in 1563 BC, he doesn't realize how much Egypt owes to the former Hebrew prime minister, Joseph. He becomes fearful. He becomes fearful that they will side with the enemies and conquer and want the throne of Egypt. A policy, therefore, of ethnic cleansing and slavery, slave labor, was introduced in order to control the population. It lasted for 117 years. During slavery, the Egyptian sector developed along the river for their headquarters. Now, early in the excavations, it shows that the Egyptian sector didn't exist. The Israelites lived there by themselves. But when they were put into slavery by the Egyptians needed to be able to control their slave labor. They needed to have overlords to see after their slaves. So they built a palace there, and they built a headquarters, an administrative building. And in this recreation that was put together by Tim Mahoney and his team for the movie The Exodus that we talked about in lesson 1, You're looking at that recreation. And this is where the Egyptians lived. This is where the Israelites lived, the ones who were put into slavery. Here's another shot of it. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Exodus 1 and verse 11. That's the Middle Kingdom of ours that we're talking about. Another shot of the Egyptian area and the Israelite area. Mud brick buildings, again, belong to the Israelites, and the white buildings that belong to the Egyptians. Now, here are some slavery clues out of Horus. You have the testimony of Egyptologists like David Rohl and others. And there was a time of prosperity, followed by a lack of prosperity and shortage of life. We begin to see in the graves of these people hairless lines in the bones, which indicates a shortage of food and nutrients. These people suddenly have become impoverished, and they are dying at an age typically between 32 and 34 years. All of that has been stated by Egyptologists because they interpret the data coming out of the ground, and that's their interpretation, that these people went into slavery. What would explain this dramatic change? They said the obvious answer is slavery. That's what the Bible says. That's what archaeology says in the land of Egypt. A tomb painting from an Egyptian official named Rekma shows Semitic prisoners making mud bricks. There it is. That's a drawing on a tomb, a painting. And what do you see in the painting? You see slaves. You see Semitic prisoners making mud bricks that the Bible talks about. Here you have another depiction. Semites from Canaan working alongside other slaves who were black Africans. Isn't that amazing? Right there in Egypt, on Egyptian walls and Egyptian tombs. Then we read about the multiplication, that it continues. And we learn not only of slavery, but we learn that he wants to kill all the male infants. In Exodus 1:12, the more they were pressed, the more they multiplied. And they spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Not only, therefore, was a policy of slave labor initiated, but ethnic cleansing. Is there evidence for that in the excavation? The team of archaeologists at Horus reported an extremely high mortality rate of newborns. While uncovering the graves of children, it was found that nearly 50% died in the first 3 months of life, and they were mostly males. What's the conclusion? They were Israelite male children. That fits the biblical narrative perfectly. And here you have an actual shot of one of the graves of the little child, one of the little babies, an Israelite baby, a telling archaeological statistic. And they found hundreds of these tiny graves, little babies, all over the site. All over the site. At most ancient sites, infant burials represent about 25%. But at Horus, infant burials represent 50% of the total population. And of the remaining adult burials, there are 3 females to every 2 males. That's a telling archaeological statistic, evidence. And then we have the Brooklyn Papyrus that's housed in the Brooklyn Museum in New York. And this Brooklyn Papyrus gives a list of slaves. It is a Middle Kingdom Egyptian papyrus that gives this list of those who were enslaved in Egypt. And some of them come right out of the Bible. They are Hebrew names. There's a list of at least 100 people, and 70% of them are Semitic names. Many of them are Hebrew names that were found on the slave. This is history, folks. This came out of, when you have a name coming out of the ground, you've got history. The names of Ishkar and Asher, you remember, those are the names of two sons of Jacob. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that these particular slaves were those two sons, but they bore the same names. Hebrew names, Ishkar and Asher. In Exodus 1 through 4, these are the names for the sons of Jacob who went to Egypt: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Ishkar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And two of those names found on slave list. Menahem, 2 Kings 15:17 is a Hebrew name. Shipporah, one of the Hebrew midwives in the Exodus story, their names were found on the slave list. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shipporah and Puah, Hebrew names on a slave list. These are Israelite slaves. And they are inner papyrus from the 13th dynasty, not the 19th dynasty, the time of Ramesses II, that many scholars believe the Exodus took place, if it took place at all. In fact, they reject the Exodus because they've got their chronology off. We'll talk about that in a future lesson. No, this took place in the 13th dynasty during the Middle Kingdom. This is real evidence for the time when the Israelites were in Egypt as slaves. And again, when you've got a text, suddenly you've got history. Now, why did they end up in slavery? Because of their rebellion to God. They embraced Egyptian idolatry. God's own people ended up embracing the idols of Egypt. And God placed them under judgment because of that. They committed treason. And they committed treason by becoming a different Israel than the one God created. The same can be true of the church. God created the church for a purpose. And if we reconstruct the church and change it into anything other than what God intended it for it to be, then we're guilty of treason as well. Therefore, God placed them under judgment. Ezekiel chapters 20 through 23. And here's the verse. In Ezekiel 27, God said to them, each of you, get rid of the vile images that you have set your eyes on. Do not defile yourselves. Do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I'm the Lord your God. But they rebelled against me and would not listen to me. They did not get rid of the vile images they had set their eyes on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. So here's what I did. I said I would pour out my wrath on them, my own people, and spend my anger against them. Where? In Egypt. That tells us why they went into slavery. Nevertheless, God hates tyranny and he hates oppression, the abuse of power. And the God of justice and mercy will deliver his people from their oppressors. They cry out for deliverance. God raised up Moses to deliver them. And therefore, the Bible talks about the birth and the adoption of that great deliverer, Moses. In Exodus 1:22, Pharaoh gave this order: all his people, every boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Moses was born to Amram and Jochebed. And then notice verse 2 and 3. What did Jochebed do? We know the story. She hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she put him in a basket and hid him among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Now you go back to that recreation of the city of Avaris next to the Nile, where Pharaoh's daughter finds the child and names him Moses because I drew him out of the water. Only one who disobeyed her father, Pharaoh, was his own daughter, because she saves this male infant and names him Moses. She unknowingly has the child's mother, Jochebed, to nurse him and help raise him. And there you can see in this photo, this recreation, how that when she put the child in a basket, the child floated toward the Egyptian palace where Pharaoh's daughter found baby Moses. There's a Jewish historian around 250 BC, at the same time that the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew, the Greek translation. This Jewish historian named Artapanus named the Pharaoh who raised Moses in his writings. Again, he was a Jewish historian, and he names the Pharaoh who raised up God's man, Moses. And the name in the Greek was Kenophras. That's the Greek name. The name in Egyptian is Khenofere. Khenofere is one of the only two kings that carried this prenomen, and that's Khenofere Sobekatep IV. Sobekatep IV, the one who raised Moses. He was the 29th ruler of the 13th dynasty, the time Moses was born. David Roll took a papyrus with the names of these pharaohs, Sobekatep III, on down to Sobekatep IV, and you count from the right to the left, and he counted down 45 years, and he came to the Pharaoh Dudamos, that he believes to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. We're not going to go into that, but I'm telling you what this well-known Egyptologist David Roll believed about the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He believed it to be Dudamos, and we'll discuss again another reason in a few moments. Emanuel Velikovsky also believed Dudamos was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. 1446 BC, Dynasty 13. Okay, now we come to lesson 2, part 2. Actually, we're on lesson 2. This is the second part of it. And here we have the mission of Moses, God's judgment on Egypt, their collapse, and Egypt being abandoned by the Israelites. In Acts 7, we learned that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of Egypt. He was powerful in speech. He was powerful in action. He was also a general in the Egyptian army, according to Josephus. So he knew how to organize, didn't he? He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, according to Exodus 2:11. He killed the Egyptian, hit him in the sand. And when Pharaoh heard, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. There's only one place that he would go to, and that's the land east of the Gulf of Aqaba. Midian is not located in the Arabian desert west of the Gulf of Aqaba. It has always been known to be east of the Gulf of Aqaba, the land of Midian. That's where Mount Sinai is. That's where he kept care of his father-in-law's sheep, his father-in-law Jethro. That's where he spent 40 years before God appeared to him and sent him back to Egypt to deliver his people. You can see on this ancient map that Midian is located east of the Gulf of Aqaba in Saudi Arabia. And it's in this area at Mount Sinai, toward the end of Moses' 40-year exile in Midian. Moses was grazing his father-in-law's sheep. He was grazing his father-in-law's sheep on Mount Sinai and saw a burning bush not being consumed by the fire. That's Exodus 3:1-3. And here's what God said to him. Moses, don't come any closer. He said, take off your sandals and act like you're in church. Right out there away from the church building. Right out there where no hymns were being sung, no corporate prayers were being uttered. Right out there taking care of dirty, smelly old sheep. And he meets up with God. And God tells him, you take your shoes off, Moses. You're standing on holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He didn't say I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He said, I am the God of Abraham. You see, Abraham still lives, and Isaac still lives, and Jacob still lives. He didn't say, I was the God. He said, I am the God. Jesus quotes this verse to prove that there's life after death. Immediately after death, you still live. Just as Abraham immediately lived after dying. So God is going to keep the promise he made to Abraham. Bring my people out of Egypt, bring them back to this mountain. Well, where is this mountain? In the land of Midian. It's not in what is today called the Sinai Peninsula. It should never have been called the Sinai Peninsula in the first place, and wasn't until the 4th century. No, Sinai is in the land of Midian, east of the Gulf of Aqaba, and God said, you bring my people out of Egypt, don't leave them in Egypt, under the control of Egypt, you bring them back to this mountain. In Exodus 3:13, when I go to the Israelites, who should I say sent me? Moses said, the God of your fathers has sent me. What is his name? And here's what God said, I am has sent me to you. Tell Pharaoh that. I am has sent me to you. And so in Exodus 5:1, Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh said, the God of Israel says, let my people go. Simple message. Let my people go. Who is this God of yours that I should obey him? He's about to find out. Who is this Lord? I do not know the Lord. He couldn't have spoken a greater truth. He didn't know the Lord. He said, I will not let Israel go. And they said, you either let Israel go or you're going to be stricken with plagues. What did those plagues happen? Did the plagues on Egypt really happen? Did God turn water to blood according to Exodus 7? Did God send frogs and lice and beetles according to Exodus 8? And did God send rain on cattle and boils and hail and fire according to Exodus 9? Did he send locusts and darkness according to Exodus 10? And did he create the death of the firstborn as is stated in Exodus 11 and 12? Moses said, this is what the Lord says. Exodus 11:4. Here's what he said to Pharaoh. About midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. God is going to go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh to the firstborn son of a slave girl. There will be loud wailing throughout the land of Egypt, worse than there's ever been or ever will be again. With that many of the firstborn dying, overnight, mind you, there would have to be quick burials to hold down the spread of disease. They couldn't go through a formal burial like Egyptians always did. They had to do something quick. And that's what we find that they did do. And archaeology shows that. There would be no time for funerals, be no time for proper burials in the Egyptian population at Avaris. All those soldiers living there around the palace, around the administrative building, living there to serve as overlords over the slaves. Many, their firstborn, they died in one night. They had to put them in graves. And the archaeologists found many burial pits. They didn't even call them graves. They called them burial pits. In the Egyptian section of Avaris, these were emergency burials in the Egyptian section. And here you see one of them, an actual photo, and you can see how they were tossed in on top of each other. They weren't buried as a single Egyptian, but they dug holes and they threw them in with arms and legs crossing each other. An actual photo from the excavation. Here you see it again. Here you see 4 Egyptians who died overnight and were thrown in these plague pits. Again, arms and legs crossing over each other. That's not a normal burial. And the Egyptologists claim it was obviously because of the plague. Again, you see a photo of the same thing. An amazing photo, bearing the truth and reality and credibility of the Bible story. They are mostly young males. This is consistent with them being Egyptian firstborn sons killed in the 10th plague. These may have been military men from the Egyptian headquarters in Avaris. They need to be buried quickly to avoid contamination of the living population. We can't overemphasize that. This evidence was at the end of a layer known as Stratus G1 in Tel al-Daba, which means it equates with the late 13th dynasty near the end of the Middle Kingdom, the same time that God's people were there. Time is right. The information and evidence is right. It matches the Bible. The Ipuwer papyrus, housed in the museum in Holland. Ipuwer was an eyewitness of this in Egypt, a historian. And in this historical document, written by this scribe, there's a written record of the plagues and devastation that came upon Egypt. Many believe it to be a Middle Kingdom papyrus. The Bible and the Ipuwer papyrus are compared. And I hate to just do this reading. This is a long reading, but I think it's important that we see this. I think that it's important that you read this. Here's the Bible. Take some water from the Nile, God said. Pour it on the ground. The water you take from the Nile will become blood on the ground. Now here's stating the same thing. Behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water, and he who poured water on the ground seizes the mighty in misery. The Bible, the Nile will be turned to blood. Fish will die. Egyptians could not drink water from it. Again, the papyrus by Ipuwer, the river is blood. If you drink it, you lose your humanity and you thirst for water. The Bible, God rained hail on the land of Egypt and the barley was destroyed. Notice, gone is the barley, Ipuwer says. Food and supplies are running short. There's hunger and thirst. Dark is the storm. The Bible, Egypt is devastated. And Pharaoh's officials ask him, how long is this going to go on? How long is this man, Moses, going to be a snare to us? Let the people go. And what does Ipuwer say? All is ruined. All is ruined. And the Lord struck every firstborn male in the land of Egypt. And Ipuwer says there's no shortage of the dead. Behold, the plague sweeps the land. No shortage of people dying. And he who buries his brother in the ground is everywhere. Loud wailing throughout Egypt. Wailing is throughout the land, Ipuwer says. Same thing the Bible says. Do you not see this is history? The Bible, the Israelites asked the Egyptians for silver and gold, jewelry for clothing. They were given the gold and the silver. The Egyptians gave them what they requested, and they plundered the Egyptians. Now notice Ipuwer, what he said. People are stripped of clothes. The slaves take what he wants. That's the Israelite slaves. Behold, gold and silver and turquoise, emeralds and precious stones are strung on the necks of female slaves. Female Israelite slaves. How closer can the Bible can you become than that? This is a document written by an eyewitness based on actual events and realities. Now, Avaris is abandoned. At the end of Stratum G, marking the end of the 13th dynasty, the main Tel area was abruptly abandoned. The Semitic population vanished. That's what they found. That's what archaeology tells us. All of a sudden, the Israelites are gone. These Semitic people disappear overnight, leaving everything in the street. Tools and weapons, and toys were left in the street. All of a sudden, the Semitic people pack their bags, they leave. The whole mount is abandoned, falls into ruin. And so what you have here is an archaeological patterns. This is not just a piece of evidence. This is a pattern of evidence. This is a long line of evidence. So when you got a pattern of evidence that fits the biblical story, you've got history. South of Avaris, you have a slave labor that built pyramids. Here's a reconstruction of the pyramid builders, the compound at Kahun. Same thing. It was abandoned overnight. Left domestic wares, equipment in the streets. Untouched. Fitting the biblical narrative. This one location mentioned in the biblical text encompasses the arrival, multiplication, slavery, devastation of Egypt, now the abandonment of the Semitic population. And then Egypt collapsed. Well, what would you expect? When you consider everything they've lost, they go into that dark period of collapse because of the plagues and God's judgment on Pharaoh. They lost their agriculture, their livestock. They lost their firstborn sons. They lost their silver and their gold. They lost their slave force, and they're about to lose their army in the Red Sea. We're going to cover that in the next two lessons, lesson 3 and 4. The only collapse of Egyptian power in 1,000 years is between 2000 BC and 1000 BC. Egypt was invaded by Hyksos rulers. When you look at the collapse of Egypt, that second intermediate period, a time of disunity and darkness, there's where you'll find Moses. And there's where you will find the Exodus, when Egypt was invaded by Hyksos rulers. Hyksos means rulers of foreign lands. So between 2000 and 1000 BC, that 1,000-year span, right in the middle, you have this dark period. This dark period, you have this period of collapse. That's where you find the Exodus, 1446 BC. An Egyptian priest by the name of Methuel, who wrote of the history of Egypt, made the following statement. In the reign of a king called Dudamos, one of the last kings of the 13th dynasty, in his reign, God smote the Egyptians. He didn't say gods, plural, smote the Egyptians. He said God smote the Egyptians. Dudamos, during his reign. That's what this historian Manetho said. You would expect to see the God smote, but you don't. God smote the Egyptians, and they shall know that I'm Jehovah. Notice this is a direct reading from Manetho. Again, a long reading, but I'll do it quickly. Dudamos in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, the Egyptians, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders, an obscure race marched in victory against our land. By main force they easily seized it without striking a blow. Having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned their cities ruthlessly, burned our cities, razed the ground of the temples of the gods, treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, leading into slavery the wives and the children of others. That's history. That fits the biblical narrative. And the Egyptians, God said, will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. You will know that I am the Lord. I am in this land. You may know that the earth is the Lord's. Exodus 9:29. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. Why? Because he did this. He smote the Egyptians because they treated Israel arrogantly. So God will break the backs of the unbelieving. He will. This is why you and I need to be believers in God. He's going to break the back of every unbeliever. And we need to trust, therefore, in the Lord, or the Lord will fling again the bloody finger of plague upon this earth. In our next lesson, we're going to be covering the Red Sea miracle, the Red Sea crossing. We're going to be talking about the true location of where God drowned Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. And until then, may God bless you with all peace in believing.